Please open your Bibles, if you would, to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel 16. Again, there in just a couple of moments. We are grateful for everyone who has set the priority to come here. We do have some visitors with us, and we're glad that you have as well come to worship the Lord with us. We hope what we have to say and our worship will be an encouragement to you. In 1 Samuel, we find a very unusual story about David. Here in chapter 16, we find that David is anointed as king, but he is not functioning as a king as yet. Saul is still king. Chapter 17, we find this iconic battle between Goliath and David, where David wins the battle, so that in chapter 18, the people are saying, Saul has killed or slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Since Saul was still king, this caused a great deal of jealousy. And so in chapter 18, 19, 20, into 21, repeatedly Saul tries to kill David. So that David ends up in a very unusual place. In chapter 21, and we'll read these verses here, in verse 12. Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. You remember where Gath was? Gath is where Goliath was from. So here is David running for his life from Saul, who is his king, and yet he is run out of his country by Saul, even though he's anointed as king and people are very favorable toward him. He is pushed into the land of the Philistines, to the city of Gath, where Goliath is from, that he just killed, the warrior of Gath. And he's brought before the king. Here's the strange part, verse 13. So he changed his behavior before them, feigned madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish, also called Abimelech, said to his servants, Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? So he acts like a crazy man, so that Abimelech or Achish pushes David out of his city, and David is going to end up in a cave. In chapter 22, it says that he departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, we don't know exactly which cave it is that is the cave of Adullam, but in this area there are several caves that might have been the cave where David fled. This is a picture of the outside of a cave that may have been here. Farrell Jenkins took a trip and believes that this may be the cave where David flees from Saul and from Achish after he acts like a crazy man. And here he is a man without a country, without anywhere to go. But something unusual happens in verse 2. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there they were, about 400 men with him. So here are these men that come to David, and David becomes their captain, their leader. He is the leader of the outcasts. He is the leader of the discontent. So what do you think he would say to these men? Well, let's go to the Psalms, the 34th Psalm. And if you notice at the beginning, the prologue of the 34th Psalm, which kind of gives the historical context of this, it says, a psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. So we don't know exactly when he wrote this letter, or this psalm. It may have been while he was there with saliva running down his beard. It may have been when he escaped. It may be, and we're going to kind of take the pretext of this lesson from, it may have been while he's there in this cave with this 400 discontented men. What do you think he would say to them? Well, the psalm records for us, I think, what he said to them. So let's read this psalm. We'll start in verse 1. Now, we're going to miss this in the English, so I'll just make note of it. that if we were reading it in Hebrew, the first verse would begin with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The second verse would begin with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The third verse would begin with the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there are 22 verses in this psalm. Now, actually, he skipped one of the letters, and he repeated another letter. I have no idea why he did that. But it is what they call an acrostic psalm. So we miss that in English, but it still makes sense, even though we don't see that. Verse 1. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt His name together. I sought the Lord, and He heard me and delivered me from all my fears. They looked to Him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear Him and delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in Him. Oh, fear the Lord, you His saints. There is no want to those who fear Him. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Come, you children, and listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. I can see David here in this cave, and you've got this 400 men around him, and he's calling to them, let me tell you, I want to teach you a lesson. I want you to understand some important facts here. And he's going to give them 3 keys for a good life and a long life. He says, we continue in verse 12, who is the man who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Number 1, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile. Number 2, depart from evil and do good. Number 3, seek peace and pursue it. I would like for us in our lesson this evening to listen to these words of David. David did not say, come, you rebels, and fight with me. Give me all of your money and I'll make sure that I'll gain for you even more. Give me power and I will make us all powerful. No, instead he says, let me tell you about what it means to have a good life. Let me give you 3 keys so that you might have good days. Number 1, keep your tongue from evil. There's one thing about the Old Testament, truths that are found in the Old Testament, and that is we can find those truths in the New Testament as well. If you would go to the New Testament, to the book of James in the 3rd chapter, James devotes a great deal of this portion of his book to the topic of the tongue, the lips, the mouth, the way that we use our words. He says in the book of James in the 3rd chapter, we'll just look here at verses 7 and 8, where James says, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Have you seen the reports on the news about the woman whose arm was bitten off by the alligator? Or along the coast of North Carolina, there have been a couple of different occasions of sharks with their huge jaws, their mouths, how they have bitten off portions of people's bodies. Imagine what it would be like to be in the mouth of an alligator or in the mouth of a shark. The danger there, the damage potential. Imagine being in the mouth of a human being who has evil intent. The power that's there, the potential damage of that tongue, the horrible consequences. You've seen it. You've seen it in the news. You've seen it in your lives, where that tongue can lash out. James says it can't be tamed. Now, he says earlier in the chapter, if you can control the tongue, then you are a perfect man. You are a mature individual. Yes, it is possible to control it, but you will never tame it. David, in the Old Testament, going back to the 34th Psalm, David doesn't say, stay away from the evil tongue of those people out there. You know, those people over there, they have this evil tongue, and they can damage you really badly. That's not what David says. If you want to have a good life, he says, you keep your tongue in check. You make sure your tongue. Yes, there's venom that can come from the outside, from other people with their tongue, and that venom can destroy you. But that venom, if it goes out of your tongue, even though it may destroy and do great damage to those people out there, the one who's going to be hurt and the one who's not going to have a good life is the one who lashes out with his tongue. And how easy would it have been for David? David is running from Saul. Saul's acting like a crazy man. He's thrown a spear at him 3 times. He's tried to kill him. How easy would it have been for the mouth of David to have flapped with those 400 men? How easy it would have been for his mouth to have flapped with talking about Achish and what a fool Achish was, or all of the injustice he suffered. And remember who these 400 men are. They are men who are discontented. They are men who are grumbling. They are men who owe money. These are men whose life it's not fair. Look at all those evil people around me. They've mistreated me. David says, you want to have a good life? You watch your tongue. Because there can be potentially a great deal of evil that comes out of the tongue. We go back to the psalm here. The second part of this, somewhat in parallel language, he says, and your lips from speaking guile, or your lips from speaking evil. What does God think of people who lie? Let's go to the New Testament, to the book of Acts in the 5th chapter. Acts is a history of the spread of the gospel. It is a time when the church was just beginning, where the gospel was being spread, and people with their mouths, with their tongues, were using their tongues for good. They were spreading the gospel. People were hearing about salvation in Jesus Christ. They were coming to Christ for the salvation of their souls. It was healing wounds in people's lives, and from person to person it was healing wounds. This gospel, it was bringing people together who perhaps had not been together in the past. But unfortunately, not everybody controlled their tongue. And we find here in chapter 5, this man named Ananias in verse 1, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession. And he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained, was it not your own? And after you sold it, was it not your own, under your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? Why you have not lied to men, but to God? Now you think about when the church was established, how many sins may have been committed by individuals in their lives. A variety of things perhaps were done by people in their lives up until this point. But God is making an object lesson out of Ananias and Sapphira, because you know what happens to them? God struck Ananias dead. Sapphira comes in. He strikes Sapphira dead. I mean, God is making a point. He could have made this object lesson out of some of the other things. I don't know what they were involved with. We are not told. But we are told about this one thing. God doesn't like it when people lie. It does not bring good in their lives. It does not help them in any way to bring about the best out of their lives. David says if you're going to have a good life, you need to watch your mouth. You need to keep your tongue in control so that you don't lie. Because when these people here in Acts chapter 5, when they saw Ananias and Sapphira being killed by God for this, it says that great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. Yes, they recognize God does not like those who have guile, who have deceit in their mouth. In the book of Ephesians, in the 4th chapter, we find that Paul is talking about the need to make changes in our lives. Get rid of these things, put on these things. And right at the end of that list of things, he kind of talks about several things to get rid of in verse 31 and several things to have in verse 32. And as we read through this list in 31 and also in 32, the bad and the good, I want you to think about how much the tongue has to do with these bad things and these good things. Verse 31, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God in Christ also forgave you. Several of the things he talks about here are attitudes, things that are in the heart, but it is the tongue that gives a window of opportunity for those attitudes to be displayed. Whether it is the negative of the anger and the clamor and the malice that is inside the heart that is lashed out with the tongue, or whether it is the kindness and the tender-heartedness and the forgiveness. Those attitudes of the heart are those which come out of the mouth. So if we are going to change our mouth, if we are not going to allow our mouths to get our lives in trouble, really we need to change our hearts so that what's in our hearts is displayed from our mouths in a positive way. But we all know, who have lived a life of a Christian for very long, we know that there are things in our hearts that well up every once in a while that don't need to come out of our mouth. And is that not what David is trying to help us to understand? You need to watch your tongue. If you're going to have a long life, if you're going to see a good day, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile. Good advice. Key number 1. Key number 2, depart from evil and do good. Yes, just as the first principle is true Old Testament and New Testament, the second principle is true Old Testament and New Testament. If you would, the New Testament, the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Paul is listing several things in shotgun order to tell us what we need to be doing in our lives, changes we need to be making in our lives, attitudes we need to be having. And he says in verses 21 and 22, in the midst of that, he says, test all things, hold fast to what is good, abstain from every form of evil. The first thing that he says is test all things. You're going to have to think before you speak. You're going to have to think before you act. You're going to have to determine, is this something that is good or is this something that is evil? And the only way that you're going to be able to determine with all accuracy, with any accuracy, of whether it is good or whether it is evil, is to allow the divining rod, the discerner of the heart and the actions to tell you whether or not it is good or whether or not it is evil. And that's the Word of God. Test all things. Understand the will of God and make application in your life. Test all things, and then he says, continuing in verse 21, hold fast what is good. He doesn't just say do what's good. He says grab a hold of what's good. Hold it fast. Don't let go of it. Cleave to it. Be glued to it. Make it a priority in your life. Continue in it. Value it. And then he goes negative in verse 22, abstain from every form of evil. Notice that he doesn't just say abstain from evil, but abstain from every form of evil. He doesn't say just don't do it. He says abstain from it. So there are polar opposites here. He gives two commandments, to hold on to what is good and to abstain from what is evil. But really it's just one commandment, isn't it? Because either you're doing the one or you're doing the other. Abstain from what is evil. Cleave to what is good. And Paul says the same thing in a little bit different way in the book of Romans in the 12th chapter, in the 21st verse. When he, in this place as well, he's given a list of things that we need to do. But in this particular case, it's in the context of vengeance, taking vengeance on others, or lashing out in an evil way to others. But he ends that by saying in verse 21 of Romans chapter 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Remember the context of Psalm 34? You've got King Saul trying to kill David. Saul had driven him out of his country, but David was the one who had been anointed by God to be king. He was the one who had the right to the throne. He had the right to be in his country. He had the right to be among his people. He had the right to stand for what was good and what was right among his people. It wasn't fair for Saul to be treating him that way. It wasn't fair for Saul. Saul could have used this as an occasion to be bitter and to be angry and to pursue Saul and to try to kill Saul. He had 400 men, I'm sure, who would have volunteered. They were disgruntled. They were discontented. They were not happy with their lives. And so they could have, with the evil and with the bitterness, with the anger of David, because reflected with the evil and the bitterness of Saul, they could have been overcome with evil, because they would have been participating in the evil in that way. But Paul seems, back to verse 21 again, to be personifying evil. He says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It's almost as if evil is standing there with a club, and evil just wants to beat you. He wants to overcome you. He wants to be master over you. When Paul says, don't let evil win, you win with good. And the only way you're going to win is to beat down evil with good. So when we're in a situation where we have the potential of being bitter, we have the potential of lashing out in a negative, in a wrong way, we have to think about the consequences of that. What would have happened? You have Saul acting jealous and in anger, trying to kill David, and you had David acting in anger and bitterness, trying to kill Saul. What would have been the outcome? Evil would have won. If Saul would have killed David, or if David would have killed Saul, evil would have won. The only way for good to have won, you have Saul. He was jealous. He tried to kill David. David could respond in kindness. He could respond with goodness. And he could restrain his evil and his bitterness, and he could do what was right. As a matter of fact, that's what David chose to do. Because on 3 occasions, he had an opportunity to kill Saul. He could have killed Saul, but he didn't. And you know, the first time that happened, what did Saul do? Saul came to David and he said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have this jealousy. I'm sorry. I haven't been treating you properly. And they had a decent relationship for a while. Unfortunately, it didn't stay with Saul. He got jealous and angry again, and he tried to kill him again, and David still wouldn't kill him. He still wouldn't lash out. He tried to overcome good or evil with good, and Saul once again relents, once again backs off. David could not control Saul. All he could do is control himself. And if there was ever going to be any good outcome of their relationship, it was going to be by good overcoming evil. Evil plus evil never equals good. So David tells these disgruntled men who are around him, depart from evil and do good. Let me read to you a description of 2 lives. The first life is described or is characterized by adultery, fornication, uncleanness, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, hatreds, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambition, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and such like. Now, is that the good life? Keys to a long life and good days. That's what this world is pursuing. That's what this world, and they have a little instant pleasure by doing those things. But is that really a good life? Let me read you another description of another life. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. We've all seen that kind of fruit in people's lives. What does that radiate? Does that not radiate goodness? Does not that radiate a good, successful, peaceful life? God is trying to help us to see what the key of life is. Very simple. Depart from evil and do good. The third key that David gives is to seek peace and pursue it. Well, once again, we think of what this application would have to David. David could have sought after war. He could have taken these men and mounted up a battle against Saul and his army and could have succeeded and could have become king by force against the forces of Saul. He could have taken what was rightfully his. He was the anointed one of God. But instead, he chose to put things in the hands of God and constantly seek after peace with all mankind. This is quoted in the New Testament in the book of 1 Peter chapter 3. Once again, these keys are not just in the Old Testament. These are universal keys that have been always true for mankind. Peter quotes these verses in verses 10, 11, and 12 of 1 Peter chapter 3. But what I want to do is read a couple of verses before that to get the specific context. In what context does Peter see it necessary to encourage his brethren to be seekers of peace rather than war? Notice we begin here in verse 8. 1 Peter 3 and verse 8. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous. He's talking about our brethren, right? He's talking about within the church. He's talking about our relationship with each other. That these are the qualities that are to be characteristic of us. Verse 9. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, a blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Peter is talking about how we treat our brethren, specifically how we treat brethren who are not treating us properly. When people do evil to us, when people may slander us, when people may give us the cold shoulder, when people may not treat us properly, what should be our response? Do we treat them in like kind? And usually the temptation is we do back to them just like they did to us, only a little bit more to make sure that we get even with them. That's not what Peter says to do. We don't return evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, he says what you need to do to those people is give them a blessing, knowing that you were called for this, that you may inherit a blessing. For, now he's going to quote the 34th Psalm. He who would love life and see good days, let him, number one, refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Number two, let him turn away from evil and do good. And number three, let him seek peace and pursue it. Why was it that David did not try to kill Saul? One reason was because they were brethren. And because Saul was the anointed of God. If David would have responded with Saul, evil for evil, then their relationship would have never been healed. The only way for it to be healed, and it never was because Saul never responded, but the only way for it to ever be reconciled, the only way for it ever to be healed was for David to act right, was for David to pursue peace, was for him to seek after that peace. He could not control the other man. He could only control himself. So in our relationship with our brethren, we need to keep our tongues, we need to do good, and we need to seek peace. Notice in verse 12 he says, For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who would do evil. He almost has this as a cause and effect. If you will act this way, if you will seek peace and pursue it, then you will be blessed. You will inherit a blessing, he says back up in verse 9. The reason why is because for the Lord, he is going to have his eyes upon you. He is going to hear your cries. Notice, keep your finger here in 1 Peter chapter 3 and go back to the 34th Psalm, because Peter is quoting here the 34th Psalm, but I want you to note, he quotes verses 13 and 14, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. Verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. Did you notice that Peter added one word? He added the word for. He's making a connection here of why you're going to have a good life, why you're going to have long days. For the Lord's eyes are open to the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. God is going to see this. God is going to reward you. God is going to be there with you. Remember in the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the things that Jesus said, in fact, the last thing that he says among the qualities that we possess is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. We reflect the peace that God is seeking to bring to this world when we become peacemakers ourselves. We can't control the world, but we can control ourselves. We can pursue after peace. So let's go back to the 34th Psalm and finish the reading. What do you think these 400 men heard in these words? What is the point that David is trying to make? Verse 11 again, Psalm 34 and verse 11. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves many days, that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking guile. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. As Peter adds, for the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears. The Lord delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart, and saves such as have a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones. Not one of them is broken. Perhaps quoted in reference to Jesus on the cross. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous shall be condemned. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who trust him shall be condemned. David is there in the cave. He seems to be rejected by his own nation, by the people around him. And to whom does he turn? To his own power? To the power of this 400 men? No, he points them to God. And he puts his life in God's hands and says, I'm going to do what's right. And if you want to follow me, we're all going to do what's right. And what happened to David? No, David did not kill Saul and take over the kingdom. But Saul did, in time, die. And after his death, David became king. And it can be argued that David became the greatest king in the history of Israel. Why? Because he put his fate into the hands of God. And he trusted God. And God brought that about. As a matter of fact, one of the descendants of David, I think we could say, lived a parallel life. Jesus Christ, who was one who did what was good and did what was right even in the midst of struggle, who sought after peace and pursued it. He put his fate into the hands of God. And what did Jesus become? the greatest king in the history of the world. David is telling these 400 men, learn this lesson. Put your fate in the hands of God and do His will. Trust Him, and He will deliver you out of all of the difficulties of life and bring about a long life and good days. If you're not a Christian in the audience, we would encourage you to learn from this lesson of David, the lesson of the ages, to trust God, to trust in Jesus Christ. Only in Him can you find forgiveness. Only in the grace and love of God can you find peace of mind. If you're not a Christian, we would encourage you, believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, be willing to repent, change your life, confess His name, be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, to begin a life of learning to trust Him, to stay from evil, and to cling to what is right. If you are a Christian and for some reason have gone back into the world, we would encourage you to come back to the Lord tonight while we stand and sing.